My last series was a little stressful and draining for me for a variety of reasons. It was an important topic but got kinda heavy and had a less than universal appeal. So today I thought I'd do something that's a little light and fun, but also show something about how apologists commonly confuse conversations by misusing language. To that end, here's a guy who does that, but in a clumsy way that makes the whole thing kind of funny but also transparent in a way we'll find revealing.
I'm sure you've heard people say that religion is just a psychological crutch. That is, it's a nice way to comfort people in the face of the harsh realities of life. However, belief in God is nonsense.
Yeah, I guess. But I don't care much for saying stuff like that. Christianity is a lot of things to a lot of people, and saying it's just a crutch seems reductive and unhelpful. I'm not going to criticize you if this metaphor helps you understand something about religion, but I'm personally just not a fan of it. Moreover, I don't think this saying is that popular among atheists in general. I don't hear it very often, and in a highly unscientific Twitter poll, nearly half of respondents said they don't find the phrase constructive, and over 70% said they wouldn't say it themselves. Keep this in mind just in case, I don't know, he goes on to treat this as some big cornerstone of atheism.
What you will learn in this video is why this argument not only gloriously fails, but completely undermines the atheist case.
Now I bet you're all wondering, how is this an argument? Well, that's a good question, because it's really just a summation of what an atheist might think about religion given they've already concluded it's not true. To help keep this straight, let's clarify that there are two questions at play in this statement. One is whether a belief is comforting, and the other is whether there's a solid basis for it. When he says, it's a nice way to comfort people in the face of the harsh realities of life, however belief in God is nonsense, he's paraphrasing atheists as saying that the answer to the first question is yes, but the answer to the second is no. And if the belief is nonsense, or unevidenced or however you want to put it, then any comfort people find in it is illusory. Thus this statement hinges on a previously established disbelief in God, and the only connection between these two ideas is that the second question informs whether the first is relevant. In other words, it's not an argument against God. It's a simple statement about the uselessness of God belief given God does not exist. That's why it's kind of a non-starter when talking to a Christian. But let's see how Lucas here tries to construe this as an argument against God.
This is Lucas from Deflate, countering the skeptics' objections to Christianity.
I have to say, in all sincerity, that he has some pretty good production values for the size of his channel. But they stick out in sharp contrast to the quality of everything he says. Also, I think he's one of the few YouTubers who makes as many weird head movements as I do while talking. But I guess that's not something I should be drawing attention to.
So let's say my friend Charlie breaks his leg in a car accident. He's brought to the hospital, undergoes an operation, and has a cast put on his leg. During his recovery, I pay him a visit. After 15 minutes of sitting and talking in his room, we decide to get coffee and take a walk in the park surrounding the hospital. As he gets out of bed, Charlie tells me, "Hey, just grab me those crutches please, will you?" Now, what will I do? Get the crutches, of course.
Yeah, I'd hope you would.
But imagine I said this, "Hey Charlie, come on, those are just crutches. They may help you walk with your broken leg, but why would you want them?" Now, would that make any sense? Obviously not. Or imagine I said, "Hey Charlie, these crutches aren't real. They just make you feel better." Clearly, such an answer would be nothing but absurd.
Yes, it would be absurd. But let's ask ourselves, why would it be absurd? To show what just happened here, let's bring our little chart back up and ask these two questions about crutches. First, are they comforting? And second, does belief in them make sense? The answer to the second question is an obvious yes. And the main reason this story is absurd is that this hypothetical weirdo is giving a no answer, in doing so denying the existence of physical objects that are apparently sitting right there in the room. So unless God's sitting across the room from us and we're looking at him saying, "That guy's not real," this is a useless analogy that shows a character acting like an idiot in a totally contrived way that has nothing to do with atheism. The second question is just an incoherent thing to ask about actual crutches because they aren't meant to provide comfort. This is where we see how Lucas's analogy creates confusion between the two senses of the word crutch. The literal sense, in which a crutch serves a concrete, immediately verifiable purpose by helping someone walk, and the figurative sense, which refers to something a person depends on for short-term help in a way that's usually unhealthy and might in the long run be detrimental. If someone is using something as the second kind of crutch, whether it be religion, a chemical substance, a relationship, or whatever else, that is a concern. And responding to this concern by talking about how silly it would be to deny someone a literal crutch they need to walk is changing the subject by ignoring the obvious meaning of a figure of speech.
And yet, exactly the same logic is used when atheists claim that people believe in God because it makes them feel better, and therefore the belief itself cannot be taken seriously.
Whoa. Hold on a minute there. Because Lucas just altered the saying in a way that totally changes its meaning. He started by saying people find comfort in God belief, however the belief is nonsense, but then here changes the phrasing to people find comfort in God belief, therefore the belief is nonsense. These are dramatically and fundamentally different statements. In the first, an existing understanding that there's no evidence for God is implied to impact how meaningful hope in God is. Whereas in the second, the desire for hope in God is said to be the reason the belief is nonsense. This is what justifies his statement that atheists are using exactly the same kind of logic as a person who denies the obvious existence of crutches. If you're going to argue that anything that's helpful does not exist, then you're forced to deny something as obviously existent as a pair of crutches. So by taking a statement that's somewhat common among atheists and then swapping out a word, he's creating an atheist argument of his own invention. An argument we might call, as much as I hate this overused and often misused expression, a straw man which he can then go on to debunk, pretending he's just undermined a cornerstone of atheism. This represents a common apologetic tactic, which is to slip in a little shift in phrasing and then rush off and start weaving entire arguments around it before you notice where things went wrong. Unless you spend all day sifting through their phrasing with a fine-toothed comb like some weird YouTube atheist.
The argument originates with none other than the famous psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud, who said in his book, Futures of an Illusion, "We tell ourselves that it would be very nice if there was a God who created the world, and if there were a moral order in the universe and an afterlife. But it is the very striking fact that all this is exactly as we are bound to wish it to be. In other words..."
Oh, apologist. Please be very careful about putting something in other words, because your profession is very bad at doing that, or very good at doing it badly in a way that suits your purposes. But let's see.
Freud thinks that because the notion of a loving God and of purpose corresponds to what we wish for, it is doubtful that these things would actually exist. And atheists have made use of the Freudian argument ever since.
Yeah, Freud just said that it's striking that these ideas line up with our wishes. That doesn't make it his argument against God's existence. It's just a reasonable observation that if somebody believes in something that lacks evidence, then yes, it might tell you something if whatever they've apparently imagined seems to fit with their desires. And this could be striking insofar as it reveals something about the made-up nature of the claim and the mindset of the people making it up. But it's not the basis for not believing it. You don't believe because there's no evidence. Saying this is Freud's argument against God is reading a lot between the lines in a way that's trying to force Lucas's parody of atheism into his mouth. It's also a giant serving of who cares, because even if this were his argument against God, why do I care if a specific person had a bad reason for not believing in God? If some guy said, everything with sharp teeth is imaginary, therefore I don't believe in vampires, his reasoning would be silly, but you'd still not believe in vampires. I hope. Similarly, Freud making bad arguments against God wouldn't make God start evidently existing, so it's neither here nor there to me. Also, I'd like to see Lucas point to all the atheists who have since been making use of this argument.
But how is it logical to say that just because we desire a thing, this thing doesn't exist? Well, it isn't logical.
You're right. Which I guess proves that you're good at making up illogical arguments and then attributing them to atheists. Congratulations?
Not only that, but the exact opposite actually seems to be much more plausible. I mean, have you ever felt the desire for really good food? Well, guess what? Really good food exists. Or have you ever felt the longing for a relationship of genuine trust, honesty, and love? Guess what? Such relationships can actually be realized. Or have you ever had the desire to experience beauty in a way that opens up your imagination and gives you a sense of transcendence? Guess what? Music that causes goosebumps and inspiring art do exist, as well as breathtaking landscapes and scenic vistas.
I'm not sure how deliberate it was, but he pulled a pretty effective trick here by progressing through a list of desires that become more and more abstract. First was food, which is an obvious object that can be shown to exist. Second was a relationship, which is more abstract but directly implies the concrete existence of another person. Finally, he progressed to abstractions like imagination or a sense of beauty and transcendence, internalized reactions that aren't necessarily connected to any specific object. He then gives a list of possible things that might trigger such reactions, including music, art, and scenery. This, hint hint, gives him room to suggest that other things that trigger those desires are likely to exist just because you desire them. But I don't know. I guess we'll just see if he takes things in that direction, huh?
And so really, just because we may long for there to be a loving God, meaning and an afterlife, simply doesn't mean that these things are an illusion. In fact, these longings give us good reasons to at least take the concepts they correspond to seriously. And that's because our common experience tells us that the desires we have are usually satisfied by things that are in fact real.
Yep, there we go. We desire X, Y, and Z, and they exist. Therefore, things you desire are likely to exist. But I don't think that's how it works. So let's go through the examples Lucas gave us for indications of how we verify the existence of things. Why do we know food exists? Because we want it? No, because it's a concrete thing we can observe. Why do we know a relationship exists? Well, clearly not because of desire. Because a person can want a relationship that never ends up existing. We only know one exists once we see the person it's with and observe interactions we understand to constitute a relationship. But really the person is the thing we're verifying exists. Why do we know music, art, and scenery exist? Because we observe them with our eyes and ears. It has nothing in the slightest to do with goosebumps or a yearning for transcendence. To the contrary, it's very easy to take desires for real things and start projecting them onto things that are made up. For example, horses are real, flying things are real, and relationships are real. And I could take all these concepts, and my desires surrounding them, and come to wish I had a flying unicorn that totally gets me on a deep emotional level. But this would just be projecting my desires for a pet, the thrill of flight, and relational fulfillment onto something that my imagination had built from attributes of other things. It doesn't take a genius to see how, in the same way, someone might use their imagination to conceptualize a being with all the best human personality traits exaggerated to a superlative extent, then use their understanding of the abstract to add traits like timelessness, infinite power, and ethereality, and long for a relationship with it. So while our desire for something doesn't make it fake, which nobody is saying, it also doesn't make it any more likely real, which is why when we want to see if something exists, we, check.
But that's not even the biggest flaw in the atheist's wobbly psychological crutch argument, because the truth is that the whole thing backfires on them. Consider this. If people only believe in God because they want him to be real, even though he isn't, as the atheist tries to enlighten us, couldn't it also be that atheists don't believe in God because they don't want him to be real, even though he is? It surely could be, because we're simply returning the favor and apply to the atheist the exact same kind of reasoning he or she is using.
Except, to my knowledge, no atheist is using this reasoning. So maybe let's all just agree that wanting God to exist is a bad reason to believe in him, and not wanting him to exist is a bad reason not to believe in him. Then we can all pack it in and call it.
And the funny thing is that some of the most prominent atheist thinkers confirm what I just said.
Oh, we're still doing this, huh?
Take Thomas Nagel, for example, an atheist and former professor of philosophy at New York University, who confesses, "It isn't just that I don't believe in God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that."
This is meaningless. I mean, I don't believe in Darth Vader, and I don't want him to exist. But what does that have to do with anything? I could come up with a list of things that do exist and I wish didn't, and I could also imagine an endless list of things that don't apparently exist and I'm glad don't. So how do we tell the difference between these two lists? Well, again, we check.
So, as we've seen so often, atheists end up deflating their very own case by putting forward their flawed arguments against theism.
No, they're deflating nobody's case by coming up with counterexamples to the dumb atheist argument you made up.
But there is more.
Awesome.
Given that atheists keep shouting from the rooftops that they only hold views which are backed up with data,
as long as Christians are expressing themselves and atheists are expressing themselves, it's kind of a dick move for either side to passive-aggressively refer to the other as shouting their opinions all over the place. Besides, climbing onto your roof and shouting about atheism doesn't exactly go over well in our society. Or my neighborhood, apparently.
It's nothing but fair to ask, what's the evidence for the argument that religion is nothing but a psychological crutch?
There is no evidence that religion is just a crutch, which is part of why I don't care for this saying.
Well, for starters, it's rather ironic that no other than Freud himself admitted to another psychoanalyst at the time that the views expressed in my book, The Future of an Illusion, form no part of analytic theory. They are my personal views. Wow, I'm impressed. In other words, there is not a shred of evidence for the argument that religion is just a psychological crutch. Instead, it's based on nothing but Freud's personal opinion, or to put it bluntly, his own wishful thinking.
Once more, he whiffs the "in other words" thing. There's not a shred of evidence for it is not another way of saying it's not part of analytic theory. Also, if Freud says it's just his personal view, maybe we should take him at his word and stop trying to construe this as an argument.
So, I guess the Freudian crutch argument used by atheists is itself nothing but a psychological crutch, which the supposedly evidence-loving atheist is desperately clinging to.
I'm not aware of anybody who's using it, much less clinging to it.
Now, those atheists who hope that maybe sometime in the future there will be evidence supporting the crutch argument are terribly mistaken, I have to say. I'm sorry. Why? Because the reasoning behind it is diametrically opposed to the laws of logic and commits what is called the genetic fallacy. What does this mean? Well, the way you come to believe in something has nothing to do with the question whether the content of your belief is true or false. For example, I could have learned about Richard Dawkins having written his PhD on chicken behavior from a YouTube video, his grandmother, my grandmother, a book, or even through a dream. The truth that Dawkins' PhD is about chickens is simply not affected by the way I attained the knowledge of it.
Right. But you'd better not try telling me I should believe something because you dreamed it or your grandma said so. If you can give me a compelling reason to believe it and you dreamed it, then the dream doesn't cancel out the compelling reason. But the compelling reason is what it all hinges on. So show me evidence for God, and I won't commit a genetic fallacy by discounting it because of any comfort it provides. Until that happens, this is all just a bunch of chasing in circles.
In the same way, it could be that people believe in God because they need comfort, and it certainly is the case that belief in God offers hope. I have no problem admitting that, but so what? Anyone who jumps on that and says that therefore the belief itself is false simply hasn't understood the basic principles of logic.
I agree. The people you're making up definitely are being silly.
Furthermore, anyone who thinks that following Christ is a ride on pink clouds with a Heavenly Father constantly tapping on your shoulder no matter what you do simply doesn't understand what Christianity is about.
I'm not sure what's especially desirable about having God constantly tapping on your shoulder, but I'm going to let this off the hook as a sentiment that didn't translate well into English. Either way, God doesn't do that because it would involve obviously existing.
Now, I'm of course aware that there's a good amount of Christians out there who actually think that and that's unfortunate. Nevertheless, the truth is that Jesus called those who follow him to deny themselves, to forgive no matter what, to love without boundaries, including their enemies, and to continuously stretch themselves in generosity, kindness, and self-sacrifice. What's more, Christianity holds that there will actually be a final reckoning where people will be held accountable for everything they've done.
Yeah, you can describe Christianity as more demanding than comforting if you want, but the simple fact is, it gives believers a lot of room to construe the religion as what they want it to be and practice it however they want to practice it. Basically, it only demands from you what you ultimately deep down want it to demand of you, and even more, it lets you demand from others whatever you want to demand from them, while being as comforting as you want it to be. That's the simple nature of religion, given a culture where you have freedom of worship, and it's borne out in all the different ways people practice Christianity.
Therefore, Karl Marx was simply wrong when he said that religion is the opium of the people. And so are the atheists in his stead, who put together the Humanist Manifesto and claimed that traditional religions offer solace to humans. The standards Jesus put up for his followers do not offer solace, nor do they have any of the soothing effects of opium. On the contrary, following through with what Jesus taught is a challenge, which is why he told everyone to count the costs before committing to him.
Again, you get to determine what Christianity is going to cost you by interpreting what it means to you and to what extent its teachings apply to your specific situation. So let's be a little less grandiose in describing it as a massive commitment with no soothing effects.
Compare that to atheism, which ultimately implies that you're a law unto yourself. Now, I am not saying that atheists are a bunch of anarchists going around wreaking havoc. No, but the fact remains that in atheism, you ultimately won't be held accountable for any of your actions, no matter what you do. Add to this the fact that selfishness comes far easier to us humans than the self-sacrificial lifestyle Jesus demands. And it seems safe to say that it's actually atheism which offers comfort and consolation for those who don't want to face the challenge of accountability.
This is some really tired bullshit, and it barely deserves comment. We atheists are accountable for our actions. We're just accountable to real people for real reasons, without the abuses and advantages that go along with people being able to assert God wants them to do stuff. And we can be as self-sacrificial as we choose to be. We just do it for purely humanitarian reasons, instead of because Jesus commanded it on whatever level we've determined applies to us.
That's exactly what the Nobel Prize-winning author Czeslaw Miłosz expressed when he said that a true opium of the people is a belief in nothingness after death, the huge solace of thinking that for our betrayals, greed, cowardice, murders, we are not going to be judged.
If it even enters your head that there might be comfort in the possibility of acting like a psycho then going to your grave giggling that you got away with it because there's no heaven or hell, that reflects on you.
So, does faith in Christ offer hope? For sure it does. Is following him comparable to a trip on opium? Far from it. Does the Freudian myth of belief being a crutch render faith in God false? Not even in the ballpark. Instead, it seems that atheism is the actual drug.
He knows we are, but what is he?
Now, does this show that atheism is wrong? Certainly not. To say so would be to use the same illogic atheists use for their crutch argument. But what it does show is that if there is anyone leaning on crutches, it seems to be the atheist, the crutch being their flawed crutch argument itself.
This is a super weird thing to say. I mean, why would we need to lean on some crutch argument to help us not believe in something we already don't believe in? The simple fact is, we don't see evidence for God, so we default to not believing, just like everybody else does with all the other stuff they don't believe in. That's where the belief part of this begins and ends. In any real iteration of this Christianity is a crutch thing, an existing understanding that God doesn't exist leads us to see that hope gained from belief in Him is hollow and, potentially I guess, that it might be used as a psychological crutch by some people. We don't use this idea to establish non-belief, and we certainly don't lean on it for our non-belief. As if we're somehow desperate to find a way not to believe? I don't know. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this and found my way of addressing the particulars interesting, even if on the broad scale a lot of it was fairly obvious. His tactics were clumsy, but they illustrate a pattern of how apologists fudge on a detail, then sprint a mile down the road hoping nobody will notice what they did. Hopefully unpacking this and breaking down its parts will, with practice, help us all get a little quicker at noticing it when we see it. This program was made possible by a grant from John Adams, Bob Generic, Maggie Danger, S.R. Foxley, The Crowd Pleaser, A Little Logic, Daniel Bostet, Nademos, Magnus Holmgren, and Q, and by the generous support of viewers like you. If you'd like to join them in pledging to this channel, please find a link to the Prophet of Zod Patreon below.